gave you a site to work out, and then you're going to take one and work it out too. So I took one today at Carrillo Monument, and that worked out great in the afternoon. Got a nice clear horizon. So if anyone wants a spot on land that you can drive to quickly, Carrillo National Monument, you can take the road down to the water, you can shoot from there. And there's, I found there was parking there. So, yes?
What time was that?
Oh, about 2:30, I think, something like that.
We were there too.
What's that?
We were by there too.
Were you really? Did you shoot the site from there?
We didn't sight. We watched the water and then saw there.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's a good spot to do this. So, what was I going to say? So the idea was to do a site, work it out. Was everybody able to take a crack at the site that I gave you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, did any questions ensue from that?
Well, we'd like to see you walk through it.
Oh yeah, we're gonna do that. So I asked the questions because I think they're probably common questions, and if they're simple ones, I can deal with them straight away. Was everybody able to make a crack at using a sextant to take a site? Okay. David Clark said that a few people had asked him about the Davis Mark IIIs that some of you have, and the vernier and how you read the vernier, and that's a bit difficult. So if you guys are having problems with that, then over the break between the storytelling part and the navigation part, just come up and I can show you how to do that. All sextants I know have used verniers, and so the Davis Mark 15 and 25 and the metal ones have a vernier on the little dial. Okay, and a vernier is kind of like a slide rule. It's just interpolating based on trying to make the lines line up. The Davis Mark III it's got a whole degree broken out into the lines you have to make line up, and that's how almost all sextants were in the 19th century. They didn't do it with little dials like modern sextants do. But I'll show you how to do that. Okay.
I do have a question. I'm on a Davis Mark 15. And when I try to move the main adjustment for the degrees, it's sticky and hard to move just 1 degree at a time. And I was thinking about taking some car wax and putting car wax in there to make it work more smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other suggestions?
Well, the question was, the observation was using the Davis Mark 15, it kind of binds up a little bit somewhere along the arc, right? Yeah, a little bit of oil, a little bit of, maybe Vaseline or something like that. After you use it more, it's not going to bind up so much. The other thing is, if you can get the sun within the neighborhood, you can finish up with a dial, and work it the rest of the way. That's probably just as easy as any. I don't think it's plastic. I don't think that, like anything like oil or Vaseline or anything is going to mess it up. But ultimately, it'll loosen up on its own, I think. Okay? So, other questions? Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to do a little exercise on the other end of Berkeley, and then we are going to, we're going to talk about history, and I'm jumping back further in time this time than I did last time, and then we're going to take a break. And any of you who have a Davis Mark III you'd like help with, I can show you that, and then we're going to do today's work, our practice, and it's really, at this point, it's kind of repetition, because the process you're working through now is the basis for everything we're going to do. Okay, so getting that down. And at this point, I know it's difficult. You guys are still trying to assimilate this. Just keep in mind, you're learning a new language, right? And it's language immersion, right? So you're just immersing yourself into it. It's really difficult in its early phases, but all of the teaching we do and the training we do at the museum, it's based on fluency in whatever it is we're doing. So for instance, if you're part of Square Wave 101, you're learning how to sail Star of India, or you're training to sail to San Salvador, if someone tells you on the Star of India, I want you to go to the fore starboard upper topsail brace, or on the San Salvador, I want you to go to the main port martinets, we want you to be able to go to that pin, know what that line does, and not have to look at a pin rail diagram or stare at a rigging on the ship. We just want you to know that. So you're fluent in something like this if you think in those terms. And that's why I'm trying to do this without forms and so on. It's a more difficult and challenging process, but you're going to obtain a level of fluency easier, at least earlier. Most people I understand that. So it's going to be repetition today. We're going to work out, we're going to actually take a site, and then we're going to work it out, and then we'll work out the site earlier I took today, and then your homework will be the same. It will be take 2 sites now and work them out. So the side we're going to work out today, though, we're not going to use a sextant, actually. We are going to use one of these. Anybody use one of these before? Right? Okay, you don't find them on mini boats these days, but after we're done, you'll see why the standard of accuracy expected from a professional pilot in Cabrillo's day was half a degree. We kind of expect a little more than that. So we're all going to camp out to the afternoon while we still got some sun. We're going to take a site visit in Astrolabe, okay? I need one person to bring some paper, if you wouldn't mind, and a pencil or a pen. Aladad, right? And these veins here have pinholes in them, right? So if you wanted to get the altitude of, say, Polaris, right, you'd just look right through those little pinholes. This is not what you do when you look at the sun, though, okay? Because obviously it can be harmful to the eyes. So what you do is you try and get a sense of where the sun is, and then what we're going to do is we're going to project. You see my hand has a pinhole on it?
Yes.
All right?
That's cool.
So you project. There we go. This is now getting in line, and you project one pinhole, the image, this little bright thing, into the pin. So you see how one pinhole, how this bright little dot is superimposed over the pinhole? Okay? Yeah. And then you take note of the time, and then you squeeze it very carefully, note how many degrees it was, which was 66 degrees. It's pretty crude, I gotta say. So I want to go pass this around. So can we go at it?
What's it called?
It's called an astrolabe.
Oh, an astrolabe.
That's okay. We got
over there.
Okay.
Big A-Dog.
Mark.
Okay. So the time. Okay. So what all these guys using instruments like that inherited was kind of a scientific and cultural and philosophical baggage from the ancient world and the Mediterranean world. So that instrument we were just using would have been familiar with Archimedes, right? Because we know he was using astrolabes. And it would have been familiar with all the people since. So Archimedes was in, I think, the 3rd century BC. In any case, it was a kind of device that people were using constantly to find their latitude. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go back a little bit further into the ancient world. If I can get this to work, there we go. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where a lot of this took place. So this is a map of the Mediterranean, obviously. And in 6,000 years ago, it was densely forested. Even North Africa was forested, which it isn't now. It looks a lot like Southern California. It's dry, it's barren of heavy timber. And the one part that wasn't terribly heavily forested was over by Egypt in the easternmost end of the Mediterranean. The reason why it's not forested anymore is almost entirely because of shipbuilding, right? They just wiped out all of the large forests for centuries of building ships to conduct trade and to try and dominate the ocean. So what you see here is the Mediterranean with the prevailing wind patterns and a little bit with the currents. The currents mostly flow from west to east, but the wind, if you notice, comes out of the north in summer, which is when the season of navigation was. And what that means is the European side of the Mediterranean is to windward, and the North African side is to leeward. It's a lee shore, and has been through almost all of history during the seasons that people were conducting these operations. You might also notice that there is, choke points in the where Constantinople would become, and that going from the Black Sea out was a favorable wind, not so going back. And also that all of those Greek islands in the Aegean made for potential strong points. They were situated pretty far north, close to that choke point at where Constantinople would be, the Hellespont. And from there they could fan out to the south. And you could also sail with a beam reach from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, which made it a really, if you could figure out how to do that, to sail across the wind, it made it a really advantageous place for trade. But probably the most important part of this map to look at is in the lower right corner where you see Egypt and the Nile River. okay? And the Nile River flows from south to north, doesn't it, out towards the delta. But the prevailing wind goes from north to south. So what does that mean? That means you could actually go both ways. You could drift or row downstream and turn around and sail back upstream. And if that was taking place on a river that flooded annually and created very fertile soil along either of its banks, you have some of the ingredients for ultimately what became a civilization. And one of the earliest ones to try and use the water to navigate and link itself together and then try and link itself to other places. And almost immediately, as soon as people started trading, they also started trying to control it. Just like centuries later, navigation was attempted to be controlled by the Spanish and Portuguese. And the reason for that is because the ships they were using to control the Mediterranean, the naval vessels, were all oared vessels because they just didn't have the mobility of sailing. They had needed more mobility in sailing vessels, but also because the oared ships at that time, the ships themselves were weapons. They were essentially a piece of ammunition, and to be able to be effective as a fighting platform or to ram another ship, they had to be relatively light. Otherwise, you couldn't row them. If they were waterlogged, they were very vulnerable to attack from other ships, which means you couldn't go very far or have your warship in the water for very long before it would start soaking up so much water that it wouldn't be useful anymore. And so that means you have to have all these places, if you're going to have naval power, that take advantage of the system of the winds, of the choke points, of the islands that you see, and they have to be a certain distance apart. So what you're looking at is a map of how the Venetian Empire evolved. And it was a series of bases a certain distance apart that you could row a fleet from one place to another, haul the fleet out so it could dry out, and then keep moving. So you could only go for a few days, and then your ships weren't so good anymore. So that actually colored the flow of history in many regards also. But going back, further, of course, when we talk about Egypt and we talk about the early navigation, the problem with Egypt, it was even had this great system where you had a river that flowed contrary to the wind, more or less. The problem with Egypt was wood. There was wood in Lebanon, not so much in Egypt. And so initially, Egyptian vessels were built out of reeds, papyrus reeds, and bundled together, and then pulled up into kind of a banana-shaped fashion, not unlike the Kumeyaay balsas that were used here for thousands of years also. However, it turns out that reeds soak up water even faster than a wooden oared warship does, as Thor Heyerdahl found when he tried to sail several of them in successive failures across the Atlantic. So the Egyptians began, when they had bigger ships and there was more investment, they began to build vessels out of wood. But there's no big trees, so they built vessels out of small pieces of wood, and they still kind of had this banana shape. They were typically frail craft that initially couldn't take the compression of a large mast, which is why you see the bipedal mast on this vessel. They were typically steered with oars at the stern, and the guys up in the bow of the ship are not rowing it or propelling it, they're taking soundings. So you're seeing one of the earliest illustrations of a navigational instrument that we have, right, as they're taking soundings. Now, some of us have actually seen one of these things. It's called the Sunboat of Cheops, and we visited that, our group from the museum, several years ago, and you'll see many pictures of that. Here it is. It was built as a kit in a way, and entombed alongside the Great Pyramid. It was discovered in the 1950s, 1952, and it's a pretty sizable vessel. Here's an image of it projected against the hull of the Surprise. So that gives you a sense that it's about as long, but was frail and not a very substantial vessel. Couldn't go out in storms or anything like that. It was a yacht, really, when you get down to it. It was a royal barge, at least that's what they think it was. It had a fairly elaborate construction. You can see here that the hull is built with the shell first, not the frames first. And the planks were lashed together. They were also held together by a mortise and tenon arrangement, where you carved a slot out of the plank, knocked in a tenon, a piece of wood, a slab of wood. It had a matching recess in the plank next to it. And you had several of these things, and you put them all together, and you lashed it together to hold it together like that. It wasn't really a keel or anything like that. So really these things could only go downwind. And you can see when you look at the illustration, the bottom of the ship really couldn't take much in the way of compression from the big mast. So fairly limited in their scope, but nonetheless, the Egyptians were able to accomplish amazing things. Now, in the scheme of things, you start to get to see agriculture in Egypt and other places about 7,000 years ago. As it turns out, the earliest imagery we have of ships is about 7,000 years old. I tried to see if I could conjure up the pictures I took of these, but there are petroglyphs or ship glyphs in the rocks in Malta that have been identified as 7,000 years old. And of course, Malta is not connected to the land. They had to sail them there. So people were sailing almost immediately after the advent of systematic agriculture. Initially, Egypt was from the delta of the Nile to the first cataract. It included at some point Sinai, Palestine, and you see the invention of writing, papyrus, monumental architecture. The first pyramids were step pyramids like the Pyramid of Zoser. And then you begin the Old Kingdom, which is from about 2575 to about 2000 BC. And that's when you start to see big pyramids and things like the Sphinx and that sort of thing. So you're starting to see the effects of trade and dominating ocean routes contribute to social classes and hierarchical social orders that can generate the kind of wealth to build things like pyramids. Egypt expanded beyond the delta to include the coastline of the Mediterranean to the east of them. And you would see these dynasties build up, change over, and then due to pressures, outside pressures, there would be dynastic collapse. The whole civilization would collapse, and then it would start up again, and they happened 3 or 4 times. The first great collapse that was noted occurred about 1400 BC with the invasion of the Sea Peoples and the Hyksos, and that tended to coincide with the Trojan War that was written about in about 1200 BC, but the Trojan War was one of those things. And also, the founding of Israel was another one of those things, because the ancient Israelites were also amongst the Sea Peoples that were rampaging around the Mediterranean, along with the Hyksos and others, and the Canaanites. And they're viewed in what we have left of the Egyptian record, all of them as just Sea Peoples, sort of like ancient versions of the Vikings. The Egyptians tended to glorify their maritime endeavors in trade and technology. They built ever bigger and ever more elaborate vessels, and we start to see in these pictures here, we have the one from the right, 2450 BC, which I showed you earlier, but 1,000 years later, they're much bigger and more complex. And you also note that what you see there is what's called a hogging truss. Note along the ship, you've got these stanchions that go vertically, and then this thick rope that is bound around the bow, bound around the stern. That rope ended up getting twisted with what hundreds of years later was called a Spanish windlass, tightened up, and that's what held the shape of the vessel together and kept it from hogging. Okay, the rig of the ship would do that, but these ships were kept in shape by that. And later, I believe anyway, that device ended up becoming part of the ship's evolution as a weapon, at least when they started building warships. The first depiction of a naval battle occurs about 1200 BC, and it was a time again when the Sea Peoples were invading Egypt, and the Egyptians were successful in getting rid of them, or at least exiling them beyond the borders of Egypt proper. There were as Egypt was rising, there were other powers, also sea powers, that were rising as well. The great superpower rivalry of the ancient world was between the Egyptians and a group called the Harani Mitanni. And they ultimately, they were at odds with each other for hundreds of years, and then the Mitanni civilization collapsed. We're not quite sure why. And they were basically engulfed with this deluge of Sea Peoples. And really only a century and a half after the Mitanni civilization collapsed, the Egyptian civilization collapsed also, bringing on this period of extreme change and violence and so forth. So that sort of unleashes a whole lot of energy. Different groups are vying for power. Amongst the most successful of those were the Phoenicians, from which we get our phonetic language, and the center part of their civilization was kind of where Lebanon and Israel is now, Tyre, Antioch. But as you see from this map, it's spread throughout the Mediterranean, all along the coast of North Africa, so that Carthage, the great rival of Rome in the Punic Wars, it starts out as a Phoenician colony. Spain is a Phoenician colony. One of the largest westernmost cities of the Mediterranean world at this time, in about 600, 700 BC, is Gadis, which we call today Cadiz, right, in the southwest corner of Spain. And they were even sailing as far afield as Britain to collect tin for the manufacture of bronze. And in this period, the really important material that people were trying to get, there were two things, two commodities that were restricted in how they were distributed around the world. One was tin and one was copper, because you need both of those to make bronze. And you can make a lot of things with bronze. You can make cooking vessels, you can make armor for fighting wars, you can make edged weapons, you can make mirrors, you can make all kinds of things. And you can even make elements of ships out of bronze. So one of the earliest wrecks we have is the Uluburun wreck, which again we've seen in the Turkish city of Bodrum, which is an archaeological site today. And it was carrying ingots of copper and bronze. It had wrecked off of Turkey and was probably carting that stuff to Egypt. Ultimately, that sort of that trade ended up favoring the Greeks, and you start to see the Greeks rise as a power. And the Greek world ultimately ends up encompassing much of Asia Minor and the areas surrounding the Black Sea. And it also, in addition, when we go down the exhibit, you'll see there's ships, there's instruments, there's maps, and there's stories. And so we have one of the earliest stories that, coming from this period is the Odyssey, which is basically a sea story, isn't it? The Odyssey was about events which occurred somewhere around 1200 to 1240 BC, the events themselves. They didn't actually get recorded until the 8th or 9th century, or composed by Homer in the 8th or 9th century BC, where the entire Iliad and the Odyssey, which we now believe was composed by one guy, was committed only to memory, wasn't written down, and it really didn't get committed to text until the 7th or 6th century BC, after which it kind of got absorbed within the Greek identity. So it was about 6 centuries between the events that transpired and then finally getting committed to a written story. But it emerges as one of the great epic stories of history, and again, it starts out as a sea tale, if you will. Not unlike the stories that you see down in the exhibit area below. As initially, not just with the Egyptians, initially with the Phoenicians, and then with the Assyrians, they began to institutionalize the nature of naval warfare and develop purpose-built ships that didn't just trade, but they were used to seize control of the sea. These were typically oared vessels, and they used two ways of fighting for the most part. One was just as platforms to carry soldiers to fight each other, but the ships also soon became weapons themselves. You'll see that the bow of the ship has a pointy end on it, right? And that was used, that's a ram. You get up to a certain speed and you smash your ship into somebody else's ship, okay, you're gonna make a big hole in it. Now, that's not gonna sink your adversary, actually, because they didn't have lots of ballast and they would tend to float, but it would get waterlogged pretty quickly, and then the vessel that's got flooded becomes helpless. What you're also seeing in these pictures is a way of concentrating the horsepower into as short a length as possible. You could only build ships so long or they would start to hog. And so it was helpful to have the bigger and bigger engine, if you will, in the ship compressed within that length. And these vessels are about the size of the Medea. That came in the form of multiple banks of oars. Initially, it was one guy pulling an oar on each side. And you could get about, about 30 guys on a side. But if you could put two banks, you could get 60 guys on the side. You could have 120 people pulling oars. And on a 3-bank ship, you could get about 180 people pulling these. So you could get one of these things going up to 10 or 11 knots, right? Which, if you hit an adversary with that, it generates a significant impact. And so you start to see this. sort of form of naval warfare take place. It's memorialized in things like Anaquare pottery, which you see to the left, and you see in this map sort of the Greek world as it stretches around through Asia Minor up into the Black Sea, as well as enclaves of the Greek world like Egypt, like Cyprus, and also Malta and Sicily for a time, and we're all Greek enclaves and Greek colonies. And the Greek world is proliferating. It is proliferating as a series of city-states that are sometimes joined together in loose alliances. And we do have a ship from that period as well called the Corinthia ship from about 310 BC. It was excavated by, he's passed away, it was a friend of mine, Richard Steffi, who lived in a Crusader castle on Cyprus when he and his wife and kids, when they were excavating this. And it took them about 10 years or so, and they were able to replicate the Corinthia. And Richard was, he wasn't an archaeologist to begin with, he was an assembly line engineer, but he developed a method of, based on a few measurements from a few elements of the ship, being able to predict what size of the ship it was and ways in which it went together. And this ship, as in keeping with the earlier ones, tended to be built shell first and held together, the planks held together with tenons that connected them one to each other. It did have frames, however, and they inserted the frames later. Initially, they were lashing them to the planks, but ultimately they used fasteners to do that. As it turns out, the Corinthia ship, and actually I think in this lower picture, I think, Margaret, you're in that picture if I'm not mistaken. In any case, this is in Cyprus, and there have been actually there have been more than 10 replicas of the Corinthia ship built. They've sailed all around the Mediterranean. And it's a typical Greek trading vessel of this period. And as the Greeks were moving throughout the world, they were encountering a larger world and began to try and figure out what the whole world looked like, how was it constituted, and they came to the conclusion pretty quickly that it was a sphere, and the elements of that world were differentiated by, or the areas of the world differentiated by climates associated with latitude. And they started to call their latitude lines climata, and here's the earliest representation we have of one of those. And of course they were able to do this because first the Phoenicians and then the Carthaginians circumnavigated Africa and actually sailed from the Mediterranean out through the Pillars of Hercules, around Africa and into the Indian Ocean, which no one was going to do again until Vasco da Gama at the end of the 15th century. So pretty robust maritime technology able to do this. Their warships also evolved in specific ways, and the definitive vessel of the ancient world was called the trireme. And we found pieces of those actually. The remains of these are in the old boat sheds in Piraeus, the ways or shipways that they hauled them up on to dry them out. But a few years ago, they found this thing called the Atlet Ram, which was discovered in 1980, I think. It's made entirely out of bronze, and it was affixed to the bow of an oared warship, almost certainly. It's probably a trireme or something of that nature. So, and you see a picture of one of these in this Anaquare piece of pottery. They're long and they're thin. You don't see a hogging truss in this. And I think what you do see, it's barely visible in this illustration, but rather than a truss that went up over a series of stanchions, there was a really heavy cable that went from the bow all the way to the stern, and that was wound extremely tight. So the entire ship was held under immense compression. Remember, this is a vessel held together with pegs, right? So you've got tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds of compression locking the ship together, right? And what do you notice about that ram right there? It's not pointy anymore, is it? Right? What would you expect that design of a ram to be supposed to do? Well, it's not supposed to break off, this one did, but good question. But if you're not going to poke a hole in a ship and it's not pointy, what is it you do with this thing?
Push it.
Push it, yeah. Actually, I think it's for the delivery of a massive amount of energy, of force. So when you crank this rope super tight, it was a device called the hypozoomata, and you hit a ship that is under hundreds of thousands of pounds of compression, it's held together with pegs, and that thing has a trigger on it. So you hit it at 10 knots, it suddenly releases a thing like a battering ram, and it just doesn't poke a hole in the adversarial ship, which is going to float away. It blows it to pieces, which explains why the losing side in battles like Salamis, there were no survivors. It would kill every single person on a ship that got hit by this. Okay, and as a matter of fact, this particular ram, there were fragments of wood found in it, and it appeared to have been blown apart in an explosion. So, again, the ship itself was its own piece of artillery, I think, anyway. This is not terribly well documented, but I look at this ram, I can't imagine it was designed to do any other thing except deliver a massive amount of force to the surface it comes in contact with. The big challenge to the Greeks occurred in the 5th century BC when the Persian Empire under the Achaemenids was rising, and they managed to absorb most of the Greek city-states in Asia Minor and absorb also the Phoenicians and all the other sea peoples around. And they were building an empire that was maritime-based, and they wanted the other Greek city-states to submit as satraps to their empire. And the deal was, you know, you can have your own rulers, you can have your own economy, you can have everything, you just have to sign on to being a part of the Persian Empire. And if we need your help subduing pirates or subduing any sort of rebellious other state, we could call on you to supply arms and equipment. And the Greek city-states in Attica and the Peloponnesian Peninsula refused. The Persians were much bigger than they were and staged an invasion in 490 BC. It was a seaboard invasion. They were met by the Greeks at a place called Marathon, and their army defeated, and the Persians withdrew back into Asia Minor. And the way we get the marathon race is because a race of like, it's a 26 miles, is that marathon?
6.2.
22. So it's the distance from the site of Marathon to Athens, because a guy ran that whole distance, announced to the Athenians that they had won over the Persians, and then dropped dead. So that's the story anyway, and that's marathons have been since then. So that wasn't satisfying to the Persians. They felt that if they didn't subdue the Greeks entirely, then all of their other potentially rebellious colonies would overthrow them. And so the question then becomes, well, what kind of ship was it that they were using? And this is our best estimate one, and we've seen this one too. It's a vessel called the Olympias, which still can be found in Piraeus, the seaport of Athens. And again, you could get about 180 people on this thing and about 30 soldiers, and it was a whole fleet of these was a pretty formidable thing to face. They had to do that because the Persians were going to just send the largest army presumably that ever existed to subdue the Greeks, and they also had the entirety of the Phoenician navy and the Greek navies and the Persian navy, and the Greeks decided to resist them. It didn't work well at first. They fought a naval battle at a place called Artemisium, and a land battle where they tried to hold the Persians off at a narrow pass called the Pass of Thermopylae. And although the Greeks won at Artemisium, they destroyed only about half as many, again, triremes as they had destroyed. And the Persians had, the evidence suggests, about 1,200 triremes, and the Greeks only had about half that many or less. So they kept trading at that basis. In a war of attrition, they would ultimately lose. So the Greeks retreated, and they felt they would be able to hold the Persians back for a while, but that didn't happen. Most of Attica was overrun. Athens had to be evacuated, and the entire population removed to the small island of Salamis, located out in the Aegean, immediately off Athens. At that time, there was an alliance of Greek city-states, Sparta, Corinth, Athens, and most of the army was supplied by the Spartans, and most of the navy was supplied by the Athenians. The Spartan general, Alcibiades, demanded or insisted that they abandon Athens entirely, and withdraw to this narrow peninsula called the Corinthian Peninsula, which they fortified. And the Athenian admiral domestically said that's a really bad idea because we'd have to split our fleet in half, defending either side of it, and the Persians could just fall on now a much smaller fleet, whichever side they decide to go to. So we should fight here in Salamis in this narrow strait. And the Athenian, the Spartan general said, no, that doesn't make any sense. We're not going to do that. And Themistocles demanded it. At this point, the Persians had occupied Athens and set it on fire, so the Acropolis was burning. Everything you see on the Acropolis today was built since then. And the Spartan general pointed to the fire and said, if you look over your shoulder, you'll notice that you have no country anymore. How is it you think you can demand anything? And Themistocles responded, you see those ships drawn up on the beach. So long as we have them, we do have our country. And if you don't agree to fight here, we're going to load all our remaining people aboard, sail away some distant place, and leave you to face these people alone. So that won the argument. And that argument was recorded by Herodotus, which, if Homer was writing in the 8th century BC, Herodotus was writing about events 400 years later. And so we get another great history story, and again, it's a sea story because that's this part of it. Well, ultimately, the Greeks did face the Persians in the Strait of Salamis, where the narrowness of the strait was to their advantage, destroyed the Persian fleet. There were very few survivors from it, and then ultimately the Persian army was destroyed at Plataea the next year, and the remaining of its fleet also the next year. And that was it, really, that was the high water mark of the Persian Empire. And so now the Greeks had the most formidable navy in the world and the most formidable army in the world. There wasn't any military formation that could stand against a Greek phalanx. And so they began to expand, and so they began, as often happens, to fight each other. And so the third great history story that we get, also a maritime story, was written by Thucydides, a history of the Peloponnesian Wars, which took place between 431 and 404 BC. It was a great tragedy. It nearly brought about the entire demise of the Greek world, after which Greece was kind of subordinate to other maritime powers. They did have a resurgence with Alexander the Great, and they were able to occupy Egypt, much of Asia Minor, and of course Greece itself, all the way to Macedon, where they were originated in Macedon. They established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Alexandria, and it became a focal point for world trade. And indeed, one of the wonders of the world was the great Pharos, or lighthouse, at Alexandria. And that, in turn, there were other institutions on that trade that stimulated, including the great Museum of Alexandria and the great library, the first library in history to have more than 1 million volumes. That generated a sense of comparative analysis of both plants and animals, and of natural and also artificial phenomena. Ships went around the world collecting stuff, plants, animals, but also artifacts, weapons, art from all over the world, bringing it back for comparative analysis. And so collecting the stuff from around the world sort of generates an interest and a curiosity of the world and stimulates further voyaging and so forth. And that resulted in, charts and maps and an increase in interest in navigation. And so we have this view of the Greek world about the time of Aristophanes, who was the director of the Museum in Alexandria, and as you'll learn later, the inventor of the noon sight for latitude, which you're all going to learn how to use. And as you'll see, he had lines of latitude in this map, but he also had lines of longitude that just went through all the places he liked the best, so they weren't evenly distributed over the Earth's surface. You also saw a dramatic increase in the technology of navigation and the tools and instruments of navigation, including the astrolabe, like the one you just used, a simplified version of that called a mariner's quadrant. And what also transpired was this device here, which was actually the star of that last Indiana Jones movie, right? The Anticlethra machine. This is a device that was referred to in the ancient world. Archimedes referred to it, and others did too. Maybe not this device, but devices like this, but no one had ever seen one. And then this thing was found by sponge divers off the Greek island of Anticlethra about the turn of the century, the late 1800s. It was encrusted with concretions, accumulation of bottom growth from sea animals. And it went into the Athenian Museum of Antiquity, and no one really knew what it was or what to do with it or recognized it. And they couldn't really x-ray it because there really weren't good x-rays then. But then it sat around as a doorstop and banged around, and somebody looked at it, and then somebody said, this reminds me of something. At this time, this was early in the 20th century, and people were starting to build very elaborate fire control computers for warships. And somebody saw one of those and looked at this and said, this is a computer. Most people for a couple thousand years had not seen computers. Turns out this is an analog computer. It's used for solving complex problems in relative motion. In this case, probably astronomical phenomenon like the moon and the planets and the stars and so forth. And there are replicas of it you can see in the Museum of Antiquities in Athens. But it's interesting, this device is every bit as sophisticated technologically as the fire control computer some of us saw on the Dreadnought era battleship or armored cruiser Avarov in Piraeus Harbor, not too far away from the Museum of Antiquities. So in any case, again, stimulating navigation, it's all associated with Alexandria being the centerpiece of the world and sort of a choke point for world trade. And then beginning in the 3rd century BC, the momentum of sea power moved from the Greeks, which had pretty much done themselves in with the Peloponnesian Wars, to the 2 great rising sea powers further west in the Mediterranean, the Carthaginians, which were the descendants of the Phoenicians, and then the Romans also. And the choke points here were places like Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia. The Carthaginians, of course, had not only North Africa, but southern Spain. And the Punic Wars, there were 3 of them actually, and the final one, the Romans got tired of the Carthaginians, so they basically completely destroyed their civilization and eradicated it. And that was the end of that. But in the process, the Romans did have to become a naval power and did begin to use that naval power to develop their own empire, which went as far as Germany and Britain. So much, they were so fascinated and enamored of seafaring and ships that they flooded the Colosseum and had actual small-scale naval battles inside the Colosseum. And in the Roman world, they kept the same choke points and same methodology of pursuing trade and warfare as had always been the case, oared warships using rams, and by those means taking control of the sea routes. But what was beginning to happen at this time was overland contact and seaboard contact through the Indian Ocean and over Asia from China. So Rome and China were connected by the Silk Road, and so you had gold and silver, such as they could mine it, flowing from Europe east to China, and then silks, jades, spices, and artwork flowing from China to the west. Some of it overland, but if you note from this picture, it still flows through Constantinople, some of it across the Indian Ocean to the Horn of Africa, and up again through Alexandria, and so forth. So part of the old Silk Road was a maritime route that also connected not only China, but Southeast Asia and India with Europe. And they had pretty good knowledge of each other, so much so that people in China who wanted to send a letter, scholars, to Aristotle, just wrote Aristotle, Greece, and the letter would get to him. You know, the only guy I know in history who had a letter just addressed to him from thousands of miles away by his first name. In any case, the Romans used a similar sort of maritime technology. They created huge vessels. These no longer exist, the Lake Nemi vessels, because they were destroyed in World War II, but they were like 300 feet long. They were, again, like the Sunboat, they were barges, but they represented the kind of maritime technology that had been in place for a long time, with shell-first construction and vessels held together with mortises and tendons. And it was, of course, under the flourishing of Alexandria, initially as a Ptolemaic empire, and then as part of the Roman Empire, that you start to see large-scale depictions of the Earth, and even renderings of direction into regular areas around the world. So going from Claudius Ptolemy, who I don't think was related to the Greek Ptolemies and Cleopatra, but was a philosopher who was able to create these maps with latitude, longitude, and direction as determined by the winds, all the way to the Tower of the Winds in Athens, which is the mariner's 8-pointed compass as opposed to the Ptolemaic 12-pointed compass. The Greeks don't like this building very much because it's a Roman building in the middle of Athens, so you have to ask if you want to see it. But it was an observatory, and its purpose was the development of navigation. Well, of course, the you know, Roman Empire sort of linked a lot of Europe together. Ultimately, Europe kind of fell into two halves between Rome and the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, and the Byzantine Empire was under constant pressure from further to the east. Asia Minor, at first, the Arab, the rise of Islam in the 7th century AD, but ultimately with the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th centuries. Mostly the Byzantines defended themselves with sea power, with the Black Sea, and were able to hold off these incursions. And interestingly, the only time that Constantinople fell until the final time was when the Venetians took it over and captured it by an amphibious attack by sea power. The Byzantines, however, developed seems to be the first secret weapon in all of history, called Greek fire. And it was a sort of like napalm that they developed, and they would shoot it out of the bows of their ships through this siphon, and it was this horrific stuff, because if it got on you, you couldn't put the fire out. You couldn't just jump in the water. It continued to burn no matter what, like napalm does. So it was a terror weapon of the period, and to this day, nobody really knows what the constituent components of Greek fire was. It was so deeply kept a secret that, again, that has passed away in the passage of time into antiquity. We think we kind of know, but it was kind of like napalm, but no one does know that for sure. We also have ships from this period, such as the Yassi Ada vessel, which is also in Budrum from the Byzantine period, and it was excavated in the 1960s. And again, you get a good sense of what this ship is like. And what you start to see with the Yassi Ada vessel is the ships start looking more like ships that you would like to San Salvador, where they have heavier framing, they have keels that could take heavy mass. They have much, they're held together still with mortise and tendons, but there's fewer of them actually. And here's the remains actually of a 11th century Byzantine vessel, the Circe Lamana vessel. And as time goes on and the structure becomes more like something we would recognize, the number of tenons over time starts to decrease in the shell, and the frame becomes ever more heavy. And what is noteworthy about that is you can now start to define the shape of that vessel, not by the curves that the planks took, but by deliberately making frames of a certain shape. And you can also begin to design it, draw it out onto a lofting floor from which to make molds or templates from which you build the ship. And that's how we built the San Salvador. You can't really do that with shell-first construction. So you start to see the birth of naval architecture, or proto-naval architecture, when you have ships like this, and it's occurring at the same time as ever more sophisticated methods of navigation, such as what we see down there with the Carta Pisana and the introduction of the compass in the 13th century, and the abstraction of space and the sort of geometrization of space, distance, direction, and so forth, all of which we use in our navigation. Well, ultimately, the final rise of the final iteration of the Mediterranean kind of way of doing trade and warfare takes place across the Crusades, but beginning with these advances in navigation and beginning with the Venetians and the Genoese and other Italian city-states, you start to see the rise of institutions of navigation, particularly in Venice and Genoa. In Venice especially, the most complex institution of the age, in fact, up to that time in history, was the Arsenal of Venice. Now, if I describe to you the following 24-hour construction schedules, split up by 8-hour shifts: assembly line construction, prefabrication or prefabricated construction, shop stewards, shift foremen, women in the workplace, equal pay for equal work, planned health care for employees, pension plans, planned daycare for the children of employees, paid vacations, things of that nature. You would probably think, well, all of those things came about as a result of the Kaiser shipyards in World War II, or maybe even World War I. Every single one of those things was an attribute of the Arsenal of Venice by the 13th century. That's where this was invented. Assembly lines, an entire society turned to the task of building these ships and being able to put out an immense fleet at sea in a short amount of time. So in the arsenal, ships were kept stored in kit form, keels and frames kept separately, planks kept separately, all numbered, all put slot A into peg B kind of thing, and where they could assemble them on short notice, launch them and rig them and provision them and man them, so that once you put a ship in the water, then again it starts soaking water up. So it's kind of like missiles in silos. You launch them, and then it's hard to recall. So in the arsenal, by the 15th century, if somebody said, send the fleet to sea, they would start in on this. And you could put 200 ships out on the water in a matter of a few days. They would take a ship that was in kit form, and they would put it all together, build the frames, the planks, the decks, put the masts in, rig it, provision it, man it, put all the weapons on it, and get it going out the gates at the arsenal in a matter of a few hours. Imagine that. Something like building a San Salvador in a few hours. That takes a massive amount of organizational skill. You could descend, ships were coming out at the rate of about 1 every 30 minutes, leaving the gate of Venice. So in a matter of a day or two, you could mobilize an entire fleet ready for battle. And the ability to do that immediately on short notice gave them an overwhelming military advantage. It allowed them to capture Constantinople. It allowed them, almost on their own for a while, to become the dominant power of the Mediterranean, and even to contest the control of the sea against the Ottomans. Ultimately, the rising peak sea power of the 16th century was the Ottoman sea power. It had a robust maritime capability, and in a series of advances, they got to the gates of Vienna. They were able to take over Rhodes, the island of Rhodes in the Aegean. They were able to conquer Cyprus from the Venetians, and they were about to take all of Greece, actually, had they not been confronted by a combined Christian navy at the Battle of Lepanto, which is, again, like Salamis, a strait between the island of Lepanto and another island in the Aegean, and in the Battle of 1571. And suddenly the Europeans, which had been in decline, had to wherewithal to amass a giant fleet to contest the Ottomans for this giant climactic battle. The Ottomans also laid siege to the island of Malta in 1565, and it was probably the largest siege in history until the siege of Stalingrad, Leningrad in World War II. It was just an amazing story in and of itself, but ultimately they failed at that, and their final effort to capture most of the Mediterranean occurred at the Battle of Lepanto. The Europeans were able to do this because within the last 30 or 40 years, they suddenly had an unprecedented surge of wealth and power. And that came from Spain. What had been, a century earlier, the most remote and backward place in Europe, suddenly was the most wealthy and powerful country in Europe, and was able, along with the Venetians and the Genoese and the Maltese, to amass a navy which could take on and destroy an Ottoman fleet. And that wealth and power came from the New World, and it came from the navigation that we talked about last time. Okay, so you can kind of see, hopefully, how all these things do interplay a bit in what we're doing. And that is a really long-winded and roundabout story that gets us back to the 16th century. Okay, are there any questions about any of that? I didn't quite get that entire question. When did oar-powered ships, warships? Well, they were used in the Mediterranean all the way into the 1700s. You know, most of the Mediterranean sea powers, like France and Spain, continue to have galley fleets until the 1700s, and in the Baltic, again, until the 1700s. The Swedes, the Danes, the Russians, they all had fleets of galleys that they used in the Baltic. So these are enclosed seas, where you don't get heavy seas and things like that typically, and you only operate seasonally. The Spanish attempted to, in one of the next stories, in the Spanish Armada, the Spanish attempted to defeat the English Navy using the same half-moon formation, line abreast formation that they'd used at the Battle of Lepanto, and that their fleet was, defeated. They also sent a number of galleys and galleases, which were Mediterranean ships, as part of the Spanish Armada, and none of those made it home. So an unsuitable type of ship for the North Atlantic. And so when you see trade begin to shift from the Mediterranean, where you begin to gather wealth from the New World, you need a new kind of ship. You need the kind of ship that you see moored back there. And once those began to be commonplace and prevalent, that kind of ship then began to be a dominant type in the Indian Ocean as well, and ultimately also the Mediterranean and the Baltic, where it would take a small number of ships like the San Salvador to demolish a fleet of Ord warships 5 or 6 times their size. So that's long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully it helps.
If the women were involved in shipbuilding in Venice, were they also in the military, so they were in the military or sailors?
So could you? I didn't quite make that out.
Yeah, so women were involved in shipbuilding in Venice.
Yes.
So were they also involved in warfare?
I don't think so very much. So women made a lot of the rigging, and they made a lot of the caulking, and they also, women along with the Jewish population of Venice, were specialized in the production of gunpowder as well. So everybody specialized in certain things. Interestingly, so there's a historical thesis for a while that was common called the Ropp thesis. And Theodore Ropp observed that the great sea powers of their time, and by a sea power, it's a nation state that their national objective is to dominate the sea. Not just use it for trade, but to keep other people from doing it, and to get exclusiveness in the sea. So the great sea powers of history, as he defined them, were the Athenian Republic, the Venetian Republic of the 16th century, the Dutch Republic of the 17th century, and then England in the 18th century. So those were also the 4 great democracies of history up until that time. And so there's a connection, he believed, between democracy and sea power. And in fact, when we were talking about the Greek city-states, democracy was a political methodology to promote something called vassallocracy. Athens was not a democracy, it was a vassallocracy. That is, a nation state whose entire purpose, culture, technology, everything about it is based upon control of the sea. It's just you couldn't do it unless you got everybody that pulled one of those oars, gave them a stake in society, and let them have a vote. You know, it's not very motivating to be chained to an oar and get blown up by your ship when it gets hit by a ram. People are a lot more motivated if they actually have a stake in society. So democracy, as the Athenians defined it, was simply a means to the ultimate end, which was vassallocracy. So we get that coming through with, with the Venetians and then the Dutch, and then finally England in the 18th century. And who knows, maybe us. It's still up in the air for us, I think. But if you read the news, in any case, that was his Theodore Ropp's thesis anyway. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that some of the ancient vessels were destroyed in World War II. Do we have any idea why they were destroyed, or did it just happen?
They were in a building that got bombed by the Germans. Yeah, in World War II. They were in Italy, and this particular building just got hit by in a bombing raid, and it destroyed the building and it destroyed the 2 Lake Navy vessels. Question. Mortise and tenon, yeah.
When they started moving away from that, were they using clinker built or parallel?
No, actually, in the Mediterranean, they started the ships. The planks were always edge fastened, right? You don't see that. You don't see clinker built ships in the Mediterranean at all. So they're always edge fastened. But the shell was made by fastening the planks to each other with mortise and tenons. Later with frames, the planks aren't actually fastened to each other, they're fastened to the frames, and they're actually kind of separated from each other under compression by driving caulking in between the planks, okay? So it's different. What gets different about it is if you're trying to rely on the shape of a vessel being a certain shape, certain curves and whatnot, well, you only got so many choices. But you can actually sit and design something on paper or on a loft floor with frames and build the ship you have in your head that way. It's not, the material isn't quite so much dictating what the shape's going to be. So that presents other options, and you can build ships bigger, you can engineer them to higher standards that way. All right, any other questions? Okay, we're going to come back and we're going to work out that site and work out another one. All right? Okay, everybody, let's take a little bit of a break and we'll come back. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go through all of these steps, okay? Because you guys need to know these. So step number 1 is what's the first step in this process? Well, it is time. That's one of the elements, but there's several ingredients to it. But the first step, the entirety of the first step, what are we calling that? Well, I'm going to call it basic information. Okay, and what is that? That's the day, the time you took the observation. It's the, what did you take the observation of? Was it the sun? If it was the sun or the moon, which edge of it was it? Was it the lower edge or the upper edge? Okay, the lower limb, upper limb. What was your height of eye? Right, because you have to figure that out. What did the sextant say? What index error was there for the sextant, if there was any? Okay, all that's basic information. Okay. And the sextant is this thing we're calling the HS. Okay? All right. 2, correct the HS, the sextant. And there's, you correct it first for the index error. We're just not going to worry about that most of the time here because either you guys either have sextants that are so good they don't have index error, or they're so bad the index error wouldn't matter anyway. So we're not going to worry about it. So you correct the HS. The 2 things you do want to do is first of all dip. So that is a factor that you get from based on your height of eye. It's always subtracted. And the second one is called the main correction. So it's dip and main correction. And the main correction is a combination of the refraction of the sun's light through the atmosphere, which could distort it, and the fact that you're shooting the edge of the sun, not the center of it. Okay? So correct this sextant. Right? Okay, number 3. Fine. Yes?
What does number 2 say? I can read correct, but I can't read the rest.
Correct the HS. Okay? HS is the sextant. So fine. Number 3, and my handwriting is terrible, I know, I apologize. Position of the body. Not your body, the body of the thing you shot. So, also, I did, in the basic information, I just realized I forgot one other thing. That would be your DR position, where you think you are. Okay? So I forgot to tell you that. So that's in the basic information. You find the position of the body. And that is defined as the GHA, Greenwich hour angle, and the declination. And we find that from that blue book we use, the Nautical Almanac. So, basic information, correct the sextant, find the position of the body, okay? Or the sun, or whatever you're using. That's 3.
And that's going to be where the sun is in degrees around the Earth and how far above and below the equator.
Right, exactly. There's
So
a globe.
that long of the sun of where local noon is.
Yeah, there's a globe in the sky, and it's got latitude and longitude just like we do, except we're calling that GHA declination. Declination is north or south, just like latitude is for us. When difference of GHA, we don't have east or west GHA. It just starts at 0, it goes around to 360. Okay? So we've got east or west longitude. You don't do that with GHA. The GP is called the geographic position, is the location directly under the sun. So if you were to take a line from the sun to the center of the Earth, the spot where it intersected the surface of the Earth would be the GP. If you were at the GP, you'd be looking straight at the sun. That's really only helpful for a concept, because you're very seldom going to be right at the GP. We're defining the sun's position as declination and GHA. Okay? Eric?
I think that was my question though, is like when you call it a GP, you refer to it as latitude longitude of the sun's position over the Earth, or as the Greenwich hour angle and the declination?
Because the GP is on the Earth itself, it would have a latitude and longitude.
Okay, so you talk about it.
But we don't end up using that for anything. It's just a concept that we use to sort of explain what we're doing. But the GHA declination is the way we define the position of something in the sky. David.
If you were shooting a star or planet, you still refer to GP of that body, or would there be something?
Well, everything in the sky would have a GP. You know, it all does. But again, the GP is really just, it's a way of allowing us to sort of think about what we're doing. It's not something we find ourselves defining in this process, okay? In fact, if the GP of the sun happens to be your position, it's a really bad time to take a sight because it's straight overhead and you can't make the sun do this dip thing. It's all around the horizon, okay? Okay, so that's number 3. Okay, number 4, pick an assumed latitude. Now, that's part of an assumed position. Now, an assumed position isn't the same as your DR position. It would be easy to confuse that. The assumed position, we're going to assume a spot on the Earth that is a reference point. Okay, that's all we're doing. We're picking it's as much easier to do if we just have a finite number of reference points. Now, the assumed latitude is a whole number. So the latitude you're going to be using in this class a lot and get tired of is going to be 33 degrees north. Okay, that's the closest. Unless you go off on a trip or something, that's the closest latitude to where we're usually going to be when we're doing these things. So an assumed latitude.
You say the assumed position is a whole number. I thought the assumed position was a number that you use to modify. That way you subtract it from your sun's position, became a whole number, and you called it the line local hour angle.
That is true. But when we talk about assumed latitude, it's just the whole number.
Okay, latitude is the whole number, not the longitude.
Right. But we're going to get there, so that's good. So in fact, that is the next thing. That's number 5. Okay, that is pick an assumed longitude, and the symbol for that is usually this, lambda, that when you subtract it from the GHA, gives you a whole number. So you start with this GHA that you got from finding the position of the body, and then you subtract an assumed longitude that you just pick, and you pick it so that it's got a number of leftover minutes and tenths of a minute that will leave you with a whole number, which we call an LHA, local hour angle. Okay? Whole number is a local hour angle. Right? Now what happens if your assumed longitude is bigger, right, than the GHA? What do you do then? You subtract it, do you have a negative LHA? Add 360. Yeah, add 360. So that's what you do. That will happen usually in the morning, actually, if you do a morning sight. Okay, so you've picked an assumed latitude, you've picked an assumed longitude, right, and you've gotten an LHA. Okay, number 6. You go into the 249 tables, and you find an HC, and the HC is what the sextant would have read at that assumed longitude and at that assumed latitude, right? It's the hypothetical position from which you've got a hypothetical sextant, all right? And to do that, to find the HC, you start off with a number that you get cross-referencing a column that has the declination, along with a row that has the LHA, and you get an HC. You also get a D factor that was similar to the D that you used with finding declination. It's an interpolation factor. It's because with declination, we've got leftover minutes and tenths of a minute, so you got to allow for those. But what you wind up with is this HC number, what the sextant would have read at that assumed position. Okay. Number 7, get a Z in. That's the azimuth to the body. That is the bearing from that assumed position to the thing you're shooting. The sun, usually, but it could be anything up there. A Z is an azimuth. It's just the bearing from this assumed latitude and assumed longitude towards the sun. Okay? That is also something you get from the 249 tables. And in north latitude, if your LHA is less than 180, right, you get a little Z number, and that's the azimuth. But if it's greater than 180, Zn equals 360 minus the Z number. And there's a little formula on the page itself that clues you into that.
The aspect is effectively a compass bearing.
Except it's true, right?
Okay,
It's not
I mean,
magnetic.
It's a true compass
It
bearing.
is, that is
To
absolutely
where
correct.
the sun would be.
Right, right,
Okay.
right. The direction of the sun.
So 7 is the Zn from the assumed latitude longitude spot.
Right, that's the bearing the sun from that spot. Because we're going to plot it. We're going to plot the spot, and then we're going to plot the bearing. Then you get an intercept. Okay, what is an intercept? An intercept is the difference between what the sextant would have read at that assumed position and what your sextant actually read. So the difference between the HC and the HO. You just subtract the smaller one from the bigger one, and that gives you how far away from the assumed position you are. So if this is our assumed latitude, and this is our assumed longitude, and this, let's say that's about 245 degrees, is the Zn. Okay, then our line of position is going to be perpendicular to the Zn, and it's either going to be towards the sun or away from the sun. So starting from this reference point here, if our HO is bigger than the HC, because this is the HC position, if the HO is bigger, it's going to be towards the sun. If the HO is less, it's going to be away from the sun. If you think about it this way, start at your assumed position, and this is the horizon. My thumb, my forefinger is the altitude of the sun. If I move towards the sun, that angle is going to get bigger. If I move away, it's going to get smaller. Okay? So you can just use your thumb and your finger as the guide for that.
Tell me again what HO is.
HO is the corrected sextant value. Right, we started with an HS, we corrected it for dip and main correction, and we end up with an HO.
Get step 2.
Right, that's what you got from step 2. So you get an intercept, and then 9, the very last thing you do is plot it. So let's say that our intercept is that distance, okay, in nautical miles. A minute is a nautical mile. Okay, so 1 minute equals a nautical mile. So we go, and let's say our HO is bigger. Okay, so we're towards the sun. We go the correct number of nautical miles. We draw a line, and that is our line of position. Okay? And we are somewhere on that line. And everybody on that line, holding a sextant, would have found the sextant at the same altitude as what we did. So all of this that we just went through, all 9 steps, was to get this one line of position, which sounds like a lot for something that's just one line of position. It's only one line because, you know, the sun is the only thing you can see. It's the only thing in the sky, right? And so what you're going to do is have to wait for that line of position. You take one in the morning, and then the sun moves, and you get another one, and the sun moves again, and you get another one. So it becomes, the sun goes to different places in the sky. Caitlin?
Now, when we're plotting this, do we use the scale for latitude or
Yeah.
scale for longitude?
Only for latitude, right? Only for latitude, because minutes of the difference between the HO and the HC, which are minutes, okay, a minute equals a mile. And the only place you can measure a mile accurately is latitude, okay? So you always go to that. That was a really good question. So, again, what was I going to say? I was gonna say something about that. In any case, so that's what you do. And the process, the navigational day starts thinking of, you might take star sight, or you might take a morning sight, then a noon sight, which we'll go into and get latitude, and then afternoon sight. But the point is that you got to wait for the sun to move to become at a different spot in the sky so you can get those lines to cross at a decent angle. So you have to be patient about it. Now, when you're shooting stars, well, there's more than one thing in the sky. So you can find out where you're at right then. You can shoot 3 stars in quick succession, and where those lines intersect, that's where you're at. The only hitch is, you gotta be able to see the star and the horizon at the same time, and it only occurs at twilight each time of the day. So you can do celestial navigation with the sun all day long, but stars you can only use at twilight. So each has its advantages and disadvantages. Okay?
If you're using just the sun, let's say you're doing it in the day though, how much time should you allow to elapse so you get enough of a change of angle so you get one distinct cross?
Well, a couple hours probably. So if you started at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and so let's say you're at this latitude, then your ZN is probably going to be somewhere on the order of 110, 120, right, and to the southeast. And then you're going to get a latitude at noon. I'll give you 33. So you got a line going to the southeast, then you got a line going across, and then you got a line like this, like say 245 or so that's going west. So that morning side, and that afternoon side, they're going to cross each other at a pretty decent angle. The closer you get to a 90-degree angle, the more definitive it is. If they're almost parallel, it's not very definitive. So
The other question is, so, what if you're not, if you're on land, you're probably going to stay in the same spot.
right.
But if you're on a boat, you're probably moving.
Really good question.
And then you
You're
just
moving.
kind of like fudge it and go, okay.
Well, it's a little. Okay, the question was. This makes sense on land where you wait for the sun to move to a different spot and wait again, and where they cross is where you're at. But if you're on a boat, you're moving. Let's say you're going at 5 knots, right? So between your morning shot at 10 in the morning and your afternoon shot at 2 in the afternoon, that's 4 hours. You might have gone 20 miles, right? Well, so then if let's say you were sailing due west and you went 20 miles. Due west, okay, that's 20 miles right there. This entire line here with your dividers gets advanced, that distance and direction, okay? It's called a running fix when you have one of the lines you're advancing.
So you
Okay.
slide
You keep it parallel.
the existing line over by n minutes.
Right. So this is 20 miles, that's the distance. West is the direction. You move the entire line, the appropriate distance and direction. If you've been sailing due south, you'd be moving the line this way, right? So you do need to keep track a bit of how fast you've gone since there's various sites. Okay? Height of eye is, we're calling height of eye, but the correction that gives you is called the dip correction.
I understand, but what are we saying the height of eye was? Because it's however high Dwayne was holding in the astrolabe.
Right. So, for instance, for the astrolabe, doesn't matter because how high you're above the horizon doesn't matter because we're not using the horizon. But for a sextant, it kind of depends on where you're at. So on the Californian, your height of eye might be 8 feet, right?
Okay.
From Sunset Cliffs, it might be 50 feet.
You got a guess as to what it is on the deck?
I don't know. This is the deck itself. The lower deck's about 7 feet off the water, and so we're probably about 10 feet above that, so 17 feet, and then you're probably about 4 feet above that, so 21 feet or so, something like that. What's that? We're definitely higher than 21 feet. Okay, so what do you think, Susan? You can define it for the rest of us. What do you think? 24 feet. We're
24 to 30.
what?
24 to 30.
Okay.
Get a lead line?
We can measure that. Let's just say for the sake of doing this, if we're shooting it for the upper deck of the Berkeley, it's 25 feet.
25 feet.
From the head.
You need to add your height to that.
You do, yeah. You would add your own height to it. Yeah, you would. And if you climbed at the top of your mast to do it, you do it from the top of the mast. But that would probably be not a fun way to do it. So, but the symbol, by the way, for height of eye is it's like a little eyeball. It's like that. Okay. These are all good questions, guys. Are there any more questions? Because we're going to work out the astrolabe site. Okay. So, let me get another piece of transparency. Here we go. Okay, so today is July 31st. Okay, we're getting our basic info, that's step one. Okay, we shot the sun. Did we shoot the lower limb or the upper limb of the sun? What's that? Yeah, that, we didn't shoot anything. It's there. We shot. It's a dot. Okay, so we just shot the sun. That's it. Do we care what our height of eye is? No, we don't. We don't care what our height of eye is. Now, when it comes to a main correction, remember it's semi-diameter, which we don't have, and then refraction. But if you look in the tables, the difference between upper and lower limb, it's about 6 minutes or so sometimes. Do you think that really is going to make a difference for the astrolabe we use? No. So I'm not going to worry about refraction either. We're just going to make this really simple. So what did we get for our HO? That was 10 degrees?
That was your HS.
Yeah, that's right. HS. That's HS. HS. It was 10 degrees?
Yep.
Okay, 10 degrees. But on the astrolabe, we're going to subtract that from 90. Okay, so that becomes, we subtract that from 90, and that becomes 80. The reason we do it is just it's the way the astrolabe is numbered. Uh-huh.
Measurement was 80, 10 was that.
Oh, okay, yeah, oh, sorry. All right. Too bad this is a Sharpie, I can't erase it. Okay, HS was 80, so subtracted from 90, HO is 10 degrees. Okay, so that's our HO, 10 degrees. Thank you. Of course, that makes sense. It was low in above the horizon, wasn't it? Right. So, okay, so 10 degrees. Okay, so now we have.
Do we have to account for refraction?
Well, we just talked about that. There's probably 6 minutes of refraction, and the instrument we use, that's not a level of accuracy that's within its scope. Yeah. So we're just going to say 10 degrees, right? It's a suspiciously round number, but we're going to go with it anyway. Okay. So HO is 10 degrees. So we've corrected we've corrected the astrolabe. Much easier than correcting a sextant because there's not much corrective in it. So we've got an HO 10 degrees. Now we have to find the position of the sun, don't we? So would someone look in the blue book and tell me on July 31st? Oh, what was the time? I need to write that down. What was the time when we did it?
18, 19, 50.
18 hours, 19 minutes, 50 seconds. But that was local mean time. We're time zone plus 7, so that gives us 25 hours, 19 minutes, 50 seconds. Can we have 25 hours? No. So it's actually 01 hours, 19 minutes, 50 seconds. Guess what? On August 1st. Isn't it? So 1 hour, 19 minutes, 50 seconds.
We're not going to worry about when the sun was actually over Greenwich rather than...
No, we're not going to worry about that because it's now we're in a different day. So we need to know on August 1st, GHA for the day and hour. So August 1st, 1 hour, what is the GHA?
The 31st.
Yes, but remember that Greenwich Mean Time is...
Yes, Greenwich Small. Got it. Sorry.
So somebody had some numbers. Yes?
193 degrees to 24.8 minutes. That's what I got.
193 what?
193 degrees, 24.8.
Okay. And what do we have for the declination? Probably north.
55.8.
What was it?
North, 17 minutes, 55.8.
You mean 17 degrees,
Yeah.
55.8 minutes.
Sorry.
Okay. And what was the little D correction at the bottom of the page?
0.7.
Okay, and it's negative, isn't it? It's negative. It's going down because, well, it's getting in towards fall. So the sun's going down. And if you look at the column of declination, you'll see that each hour it's going down by 7/10 of a minute. So that's our D factor. It's going down by 7/10 of a minute each hour. Okay. Were there any questions so far about this thus far? Okay, everybody got that? Okay. Minutes and seconds for GHA. So we've got 19 minutes and 50 seconds. So can someone go to the 19-minute page? And tell me for 19 minutes and 50 seconds what we add to for the GHA? For 19 minutes, what was it? 19 minutes. Yeah.
And 50 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah, 4 minutes and 4 minutes.
4 degrees, you mean?
I'm sorry, 4 degrees, 57.5 seconds.
Okay. So, 5 is 13. 5 and 7 is 12. 3 and 5 is 8. 197. Can't have 82 minutes, so that becomes 198. That's an 82, so that's 22.3 minutes is GHA. So we see that when we added it, we ended up with 82 minutes, so we track 60 and carry that over from 197 to 198. Okay, so I can save a little bit of time here with the declination delta. So if the declination is decreasing by 7/10 of a minute each hour, if we're only, well, wait a second, at 19 minutes, that's about a third of an hour. So it's going to be about minus 0.2, isn't it? Why don't we go to that minutes and seconds page and see what it actually is. Go to 19 minutes, 50 seconds, go to the column that says B or D correction, look at 0.7, and what is it at?
0.2.
Okay, how about that? Minus 0.2. So this becomes 55.6 minutes, north 17 degrees, 55.6. Okay, so
What was this one we just did?
what we did was declination. So we looked at the declination.
So the 198 is the latitude.
198 is GHA,
Okay, GHA.
right? Declination, we started with 17, 55.8. From the bottom of the page, we got that was the rate of declination was changing 7/10 of a minute each hour. And because we have 19 minutes and 50 seconds of the hour, we subtract 0.2 minutes. If it's changing at 7/10 of a minute per hour, over the part of the hour we actually experienced, it was minus 0.2. So we end up with a declination of north 17, 55.6, GHA of 198, 22.3. So now we've completed the find the position of the sun, haven't we? What's our next step? What do we do now?
Soon.
Yep. I'm sorry? Minus 0.2, yeah. Yeah, it's minus 0.2 is what I put down. It's minus 0.2. Okay, so, any other question? Okay, so next step,
Oh, it did, right.
0.2 minutes per hour
the sun is moving to the south 0.2 minutes per hour. Yeah.
at this time.
At this time of year. Oh, 0.7, right. During the part of the hour that we experienced, it was 0.2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Part of the hour is because it was 19 minutes.
19 minutes, about a third of an hour. So about a third of 0.7 is 0.2.
Okay.
Right.
So this is.
Okay, so the next step is pick the assumed latitude, right? So this is a pretty easy one by now. AL equals north 33 degrees. Okay? Okay. So 33 degrees. Okay, now the assumed longitude, which is this symbol here, is the longitude that when we subtract it from the GHA gives us a whole number. Now we're at about 117.20 something, is that right? 17 or 18 something, is that our assumed longitude? Yeah, okay, so 22.3 is the closest. So we're going to subtract 117 degrees, 22.3 minutes. Okay, so that's 1 and that's 8. And LHA equals 81 degrees. Okay, so we've picked an assumed latitude and an assumed longitude. We're actually going to plot this point on a chart. Okay? Okay, LHA is 81 degrees. So now what we have to do is we have to find an HC, what the sextant would have read at that assumed latitude and longitude. So let's go to the 249 tables. And we want to go to the pages that say latitude. Please get start on the next one because we are running kind of late. So, does everybody have this? Can I turn this machine off? Yeah? Okay, astrolabe is done. Okay, all right, so I wonder if we can try to get started working this, and we're gonna do this until 8:30, okay? Or unless you have to leave now and you can do that. But you guys get into groups of 4 people, okay? Because it's gonna be a team, and I'm gonna give you the following information. Okay, this shot was taken today, July 31st, 2024. The DR position was 32 degrees, 40 minutes north, 117 degrees, 15 minutes west. The DR position was 32 degrees, 40 minutes north, 40. 40. Okay, 32 degrees, 40 minutes north. 40? 40, F-U-R-T-Y. 117 degrees, 15 minutes west. Okay? Height of eye was 50 feet. 50. The sun is what we shot, and we shot the lower limb. Okay? The initial time was 14 hours, 21 minutes, 00 seconds, to which we add the stopwatch, 03 minutes, 7 seconds. Okay? The HS was 65 degrees, 3.7 minutes. So 65 degrees, 03.7 minutes. Okay, so guys, go to town. Get your team together. We've only got 20 minutes to try and get as much as we can.